Hi, I'm Rob Ritchie, Executive Director of FairVote, and we are exceptionally pleased to have you all here and to be able to do these series of forums, the Democracy Next forums with, am I echoing? With New York University in this lovely facility, and they're great partners in this effort, and their head of the facility usually would say hello, but he's out right now, so we're just going to welcome you on behalf of NYU and FairVote, and we will be plunging right into what should be an excellent dialogue about something that is incredibly timely and incredibly important. There's nothing much more fundamental to a representative democracy than the right to vote. Not the only fundamental part of a right to vote, as we might see in countries like Egypt today, but also at the core of what we need to uphold, protect, and exercise to have the representative democracy we deserve. FairVote has been working on this issue for a number of years. We work on a range of reforms. I hope you can grab our little postcard out in the back during the reception, which, by the way, you're all welcome to join us for a reception. We'll have FairVote staffers and interns there to be able to talk about our work, and I hope some of the panelists will stay and be able to talk with you as well. So please stay for that. You know, at the core of what elections are is that participation. We believe we need to go beyond access to a fair vote that reflects what we want when we have representative legislatures, we have real choices, we earn a seat at the table. That's the full meaning of a representative democracy. But at its beginning, it's that opportunity to vote. I've been reading documents about the founding convention and James Madison and James Wilson and other of the key leaders of efforts to set up the Constitution. And that word consent in consent of the governed was exceptionally important, more so than I think we don't use that word politically as much as they did at the time, but that even if what they meant by suffrage then is a little bit different than what we mean today, it also had the same intention, which is that to have a functioning republic, to have a representative democracy, we must measure the consent of the governed. And that's why for the House of Representatives, they wanted to the full degree that they could see as possible being the place where democracy happened. There's a lot of ways that democracy isn't happening the way that it needs to, and we'll be touching on those today. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark Schmitt, who is going to moderate this session and has also written very intelligently on this for the journal Democracy, and has worked on right to vote and democracy issues, campaign finance, for years, going back to working for Senator Bill Bradley at the Open Society Institute as the American Prospect executive editor, and now at the Roosevelt Institute, where a continuous thread through all that has been in very insightful, thoughtful ways of looking at politics and how we can make it better. So glad you can be here, Mark.
Thank you very much, Rob. I appreciate anybody who can find any kind of continuous thread in my motley career. I'm really glad to be here and appreciate NYU for hosting this great event. One of the things I always like to mention is that until they changed the naturalization test a couple of years ago, one of the questions that you had to answer to become a U.S. citizen was, what is the most important right that is held by a U.S. citizen? And the correct answer to that question, if you wanted to become a citizen, was the right to vote. Now, it's a little bit of a trick question because obviously, if you might think the right to free speech or something like that is a more important question, but it's really what's the right that citizens hold that non-citizens don't hold. And unfortunately, it's not a correct answer because citizens actually don't have an affirmative right to vote. It's not present in the Constitution. And as we've seen with the Shelby County case this week and the hundreds and hundreds of voting rights cases and battles at all levels, twice as many in the last decade as in the decade before, the arguments about the voting wars, as Rick Hazen calls them, the scholar who runs the election law blog, the voting wars are alive and well, and the courts there's really nothing like the kind of standard to judge them by that we have in when it comes to other things that are clearly mentioned rights in the Constitution. So the idea of a right to vote amendment to the Constitution is, it's a great idea to kind of bring some clarity to these voting wars. It's also a great way to give a movement that has a lot of angles to it, and I've seen a lot of those different angles, to give it a kind of focal point that that puts people in a good, strong direction. One of the things I found when I wrote this article that Rob mentioned in Democracy Journal along with Jonathan Soros, who actually knows a lot more about this issue than I did going into it, one of the things that was interesting to me is to realize there's a lot of real, beyond just the statement that we should have an affirmative right to vote, there's a lot of variation in what an amendment might look like, what its scope might be, how much it might include an affirmative statement of a federal role in election administration and so forth. So there's a lot of room, I think, for a very productive discussion along those lines. I think what's in common about the group here, and I'll do real quick introductions and then get out of the way, is that there's a real interesting interplay between people's experiences at the local level and bringing it back to the national level where you need this kind of answer. So, Congressman Pocan, who's terrific to have here, has been he spent 12 years in the Wisconsin legislature as a major progressive leader on a lot of issues, including privatization. I believe he was one of the few progressive Democratic legislators to join ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and kind of come back to really talk about what that organization represents. Anybody could do it, but he did it. And obviously, Wisconsin has been a site of huge battles over democracy in all its guises, including the right to organize. But now brings the perspective of that experience to Congress, where he was elected to succeed Congresswoman Tammy Baldwin in 2012, and along with Keith Ellison from Minnesota, took the lead in introducing a right to vote amendment to the Constitution, which I thought got a really nice amount of attention, and which is an indication, I think, that there's some real readiness to talk about this issue. Judith Browne Dyannis is an old friend of mine, co-director of the Advancement Project, and part of the Advancement Project since its inception in 1999. Previously, a leading attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. I think of the Advancement Project, which again, Advancement Project works all over the country locally over voting rights fights, fights about criminal justice and school discipline, a whole range of issues. I think of their sort of secret as they're the people who understand that litigation is important, but politics matters too, and that power has a lot to do with it. Tim Male to her right, or stage right or whatever, is the Ward 2 council member in Takoma Park, and he is also the Vice President of Defenders of Wildlife, and again, the Takoma Park experience, I think, shows how not just defensive battles, but opportunities can begin to create that local national connection. Rashad Robinson is the Executive Director of Color of Change, previously at GLAAD, and has been involved in FairVote for a long time. Rashad is probably the smartest person you'll meet about what goes into putting an idea into the cultural as well as the political mainstream debate, and has an extraordinary track record to do it. And Patricia Hart is the director of the Promote Our Vote project at FairVote. She's a 2012 graduate of Eastern Kentucky University and created the organization Feminists for Change, and we're looking forward to hearing from her as well. So I will just turn it over to Congressman Pocan, and again, appreciate our thanks both for the amendment and for being here.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you, everyone, for being here today. I just want to thank NYU and DC for hosting this. In fact, Carrie, as she's walking up here, our intern in the office is a graduate of NYU, so she's especially proud. And I'd like to thank FairVote for helping organize this and for all the work that you do to help strengthen democracy. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Pocan. I'm a freshman and congressman from South Central Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin. Just finished my first 6 months in office, so I figured it was time to amend the Constitution. But As Mark mentioned, as a state legislator actually for 14 years, and before that local government for 3 terms as a county board supervisor, back when Tammy Baldwin was on the county board, we go back quite a ways, I've followed a number of issues, whether it be from joining ALEC and really seeing some of the nefarious things that are out there that people are up to, whether it be at the local or state level, that really does connect to the federal level. And one of the things I think that we've seen across so many states is this really attack on people what should be a fundamental right to vote. And as Mark mentioned, when someone comes in, an aspiring American, and takes the citizenship test, the question they're asked is, what's the most important right to U.S. citizens? And the answer that they're expected to give is the right to vote. And because of that, it's the most fundamental right. That basically all of our rights come back down to that we are a part of the democracy and that our vote matters in choosing that democracy. So you'd think that the U.S. Constitution would explicitly have a right to vote in it. I certainly did, but I was wrong, because we very quickly found out that no matter what you thought about what the Constitution said and what those principles were, there's not an explicit right to vote in the Constitution. And I guess what you have to remember is that when our Constitution was ratified, the right to vote was specifically not guaranteed. That's because it was incredibly restrictive. Only white male property owners above the age of 21 could vote, which was less than 20% of the population. And many of our founders specifically did not want to expand the franchise, believing most in society were unqualified for the what they called privilege. John Adams famously wrote that, quote, "It is dangerous to open so fruitful a source of controversy and altercation as would be opened by attempting to alter the qualifications of voters. There will be no end of it," unquote. So this is what we have to remember, why there was not originally that fundamental right to vote. Now, since that time, I think our attitudes have changed slowly but progressively. The fact that the Constitution has amendments that prohibit discrimination specifically on race and gender and age demonstrates that we possess no guaranteed right to vote in our Constitution. While it's certainly implied, and we have these amendments, there is no explicit right. And meanwhile, these accomplishments have often been accompanied by a myriad of tactics, laws, and strategies that have been meant to suppress the vote. Things like literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, voter intimidation. And the targets of these discriminatory efforts have changed as well. We know many of the original measures out there were to keep Irish Catholic immigrants from voting. Then we saw a wide variety of efforts to keep African Americans from the polls. Now today, the bills that we see to restrict the right to vote may be less forthright, and the lawmakers wish to suppress are a little less hard to define, but these efforts are nonetheless discriminatory. We have seen burdensome requirements for registration, and registration reduced early voting opportunities, which are critical for low-income Americans who cannot take off the day to vote on Election Day. African Americans and Latinos in particular have utilized early voting in high numbers. College students have been the targets of a number of efforts to decrease their participation, from disallowing student IDs as an acceptable form of voter identification, to stricter residency requirements, to limiting polling locations on campuses. Voter ID and burdensome registration requirements often sometimes make it harder for senior citizens to be able to vote. So these are some of the modern techniques that we've seen that are out there that work on this. I myself didn't realize the full extent of the attack on the right to vote until voter IDs were first introduced in Wisconsin. And as the case with voter ID laws, Republicans justified the photo ID requirement as a way to counter fraud in our state. Now, the fact of the matter is, this crisis, that voter fraud is a fraud in of itself. As the Brennan Center for Justice points out, you are more likely to be killed by a lightning strike than you are to commit voter fraud in your lifetime. That's the reality for what we have all of these laws out there. In Wisconsin, we're really proud. It's Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Maine are the top 3 states, depending on the election, for voter turnout. We have extremely clean, strong laws, including same-day registration in our state. Our Wisconsin Chief Election Officer has found that since 2000 in statewide elections, the state has seen about 20 instances of voter fraud out of more than 6 million votes cast. and most of the instances of voter fraud involve felons who were ineligible to vote, a problem that wouldn't have been fixed by a photo ID. I sat through one of these about 8-hour hearings that we had when I was on our Campaigns and Elections Committee in our state assembly, and at the end of this long day of the Republicans putting up testimony that's invited only, what came out of it was there was one senior elderly woman from Milwaukee who had just become a citizen who went in to go to vote, and her name was checked off. That was 8 hours worth of research and fraud after a presidential election. So why did the Wisconsin legislature believe we needed to combat against voter fraud? Well, what does it mean to have a cure in search of a disease? In my experience, it means there's usually an ulterior motive. And in the case of restrictive voting laws, the design is to suppress the vote, to encourage lower voter turnout in the hopes of influencing elections. In other words, to have elected officials pick their voters rather than voters picking their elected officials. Now, in Wisconsin, we were fortunate that our state constitution specifically guarantees the right to vote. And because of this provision, the suppressing voting laws have been mostly blocked by our courts in our state. But what I didn't realize was that while Wisconsin had a strong right to vote amendment, our nation's constitution didn't. And that's ultimately what brought us to take a look at doing this right to vote constitutional amendment. Without a federal guaranteed right to vote, you will continue to see the types of disenfranchisement that has been a plague on current elections in America. And that takes us to today, and really last month's Supreme Court decision to strike down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 4 was the Act's pre-clearance formula, the formula that determined which states and counties needed to get federal approval before making voter law changes because they viewed it as outdated, the Supreme Court said, and thus unconstitutional. Now, you and I may have a little different opinion. Back in 2006, there were 390 supporters in the U.S. House. You know, we get those votes all the time these days in the House, and 98 to nothing in the Senate. So there clearly wasn't that controversy in 2006 as it came through the Congress. And despite the fact that it's proved to be highly effective in countering voter suppression efforts, already since the court's decision, 6 of the 9 states covered by the act have begun to move forward on restrictive voting measures. Now, I happen to somewhat agree with the court that the formula was outdated. As I previously detailed, it doesn't reflect the current attempts to restrict the right to vote. In fact, it underestimates them. So let's look at it this way. Under the Voting Rights Act, 9 entire states and certain counties and 6 others were covered. But in this year alone, we know that in 30 states, there have been over 80 laws introduced to somehow restrict voting rights. And now even more since the Supreme Court decision. So given my experience in Wisconsin, what I see in the states across the country, and from going to groups like ALEC and trying to see what the right's up to, we knew we wanted to take action. So I worked very closely with Representative Keith Ellison, a part of the Progressive Caucus, and we got together and with FairVote to work on a right to vote amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would guarantee an affirmative right to vote for all Americans. Our amendment is as simple as it is necessary. It says that every American citizen possesses the fundamental right to vote in any public election where they reside, and Congress has the power to protect this right. So the amendment would create an important change from current policy. Right now, an American has to prove they've been wronged by a law change that affects someone's access to voting. Instead, with this amendment, the burden of proof would be left to the states to demonstrate that any efforts they take will not deny or abridge their fundamental right to vote. So it's a very important distinction what will happen by having a U.S. constitutional amendment. Our right to vote is the great equalizer. What I like to say is the one thing that I have in common with the Koch brothers is that my brother and I and the Koch brothers have one thing in common, a right to vote. What you have in common with Sheldon Adelson is one thing. You each have one vote when you go to the polls. So I understand that ratifying the U.S. Constitution is not an easy task, but on this measure, it's a deeply important one. We can and we must build the grassroots movement needed to ensure our most fundamental right is not subject to the partisan whims of individual state legislatures. That's why discussions like we're having today is so important. We need to get people talking. To see just what exactly is happening state after state across the country, to get them informed and motivated to act. That's how we can ultimately make sure that we can succeed on a constitutional amendment. At the end of the day, the right to vote is not a Republican right. It's not a Democratic right. It's an American right. And if the recent Voting Rights Act decision demonstrates anything, it's that we all need to be doing all we can to protect this right. I do apologize. I am going to have to sneak out early, unfortunately, at the panel because we're in the middle of appropriations and we do have votes. At least it's not the 38th time to repeal the Affordable Care Act, but it is other things. But I appreciate your interest in being here today, and I'm really, I know some of our staff are staying behind, looking forward to hear what the panel has to say. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was terrific. I'm just going to introduce, well, I did introduce Judith Browne Dyannis. I think we'll have the speakers speak briefly from the podium, and then we'll do some Q&A, which I think will be, where we're going to do it written? And so we'll do, if you'll send up questions to me. And I failed to introduce John Nichols because he's not here yet, and I'll introduce him when he gets here.
Good afternoon. Please excuse me, I am just back from vacation, so I'm a little relaxed about an issue that I should not be relaxed about. I think that we all need to be invigorated about this issue about the right to vote. As the Congressman did explain, we have seen really a rollback of voting rights. At Advancement Project, we say that it's the most large-scale rollback of voting rights that we've seen in a century. We have seen both, at the state level, efforts to make it harder to vote, to restrict voting by particular groups. And while we saw some victories in trying to stop that from happening in 2012, mostly through litigation, Advancement Project was involved in litigation in many of the states trying to prevent voter ID from happening. Many of those victories were temporary wins. Because we see ourselves back in the courts. In fact, our voter ID case in Pennsylvania is moving forward to trial in the next few weeks. And so temporary wins. In responding to the Congressman, I do think that one thing that we have to understand is that voting has always in this country been manipulated by people who are in power and people who have money. And that what we have seen over the past couple of years in terms of rollbacks really is nothing new. It is those in power trying to hold on to power. The way that we see this is that as we see changing demographics in America, there's a real fear about how power will change, who will have power. When you look at the rising electorate, the number of Latinos, 18,000, I believe it is, 50,000 turning 18 every month, and what that means to the changing demographics of America and what could happen in the future. There are those who fear what will happen to their own personal power, but also to their party's power. And so when we look at this issue, we have to go back to the historical context. When we look at voting, really, over time, many groups could not vote. Jews couldn't vote, the Irish couldn't vote, Chinese couldn't vote. Native Americans were told at one time that they weren't citizens and could not vote. How about that? African Americans could not vote, then we could vote, then we couldn't vote again, then we could vote. And now we're seeing it we're getting to a point where it's harder for African Americans to vote yet again. And so this has always been kind of the trend in the United States. One of the challenges that we have around establishing a right to vote really is the whole construct of states' rights. Because the compromise that was made when this country was set up was that states should have rights. It was one way of keeping the Union together after the Union had split, was that we needed to give the states back their rights. And unfortunately, what went with that was also who gets to participate in deciding who should be in power in those states. And so from the times of having property ownership to poll taxes to grandfather clauses to literacy tests. We've seen that change over time, and if you look at the history of it, it really got to the point where some states put in place restrictions because they didn't want particular groups to move to those states. So putting in place a literacy test in a place where you saw an influx of African Americans moving after slavery was over, or residency requirements, actually came out of the desire to limit voting of particular groups who were moving into states. And so this is the sordid history of voting in this country. And so the question is whether or not we are ready to move towards something bigger, whether we're really ready to move towards the ideal of a true democracy, where people get to elect those who make the laws that govern their daily lives. If we're really ready to let that power of the vote, of the ballot, to be extended to all citizens. And so I think for this movement that we are building, this is really about what is America about? What is citizenship about? What is the mark of citizenship is to participate in our democracy and to have a say in what happens in our country. And so I think we're going to see over time, you would think that people would say, oh, no one should be against the right to vote. The congressman could put forth a bill and no one should vote that down. Well, I can tell you that we actually put forth a bill in the state of Florida, which is the poster child for everything that goes wrong around elections, and that bill died a very untimely death. To really establish the right to vote in the state of Florida. There actually is a state constitutional right to vote, but we wanted to strengthen it. And it died very quickly. It was called Dessalines Free and Fair Democracy Act, named after the 102-year-old woman, Dessalines Victor, who came to the State of the Union address here in DC. And quickly we found that not everyone is about the right to vote. But here's why we think we need to establish it. One is that we need to make sure that there is participation. Two is that we have to strengthen the standards by which courts view the right to vote. We have seen the courts eviscerating any semblance of a right to vote that goes back, and we could talk about from the Bush v. Gore decision to the Indiana voter ID case. We have seen courts moving away from the idea that strict scrutiny should be used and that there has to be a compelling state interest in any restriction on voting. And so now we even see courts that are looking at state constitutional provisions and using federal jurisprudence to decide. The states are even looking away from their own constitutions. We have, actually, if you look at many of the cases that were brought in 2011 and 2012 to fight the voter suppression laws, they were brought under state constitutions because we felt that we could have we'd have stronger provisions in state law than we do under the United States Constitution. But then we start to see state courts say, well, let's look at what the federal courts say about the right to vote. And that's the last place we want them to look when we're talking about the right to vote. And so we have to do that. We have to put in place the compelling state interest and using the strict scrutiny standard. The other piece is that we need national standards. There are 13,000 election jurisdictions in this country that run elections 13,000 different ways. Local election officials have a lot of discretion over how they interpret the state laws about how to run elections. And so part of what we need to do is have national standards. When I'm voting for president, why should I, in my state, be able to vote by early voting, but I'm in Maryland, but then I go into Virginia, and there is no early voting. And I have to have an excuse to vote by absentee ballot. And that excuse has to be something like, I am going to be out of the state on that day, or I'm going to be working for 12 consecutive hours, and I'm going to be out of the county, so I can't get to. So why do we have these differences when we should all be voting the same way? And that it should be easy. not difficult. And so that's the other piece that we believe has to happen in establishing this right to vote, is that we have to have some national standards. Now, that's the part that really gets in the way of states' rights. Because for partisan gain, there have been many officials throughout this country who have tried to make it harder to vote for their own personal gain or their own party's gain, and for the gain of the elite. And so we've got to overcome that. And the way that we're going to be able to do that is to really build a movement. What we saw in 2011 and 2012, I waited in line for 7 hours in the state of Maryland. We were not a battleground state as far as I know. We did have important ballot initiatives on the ballot. However, the discussion in line in Prince George's County with mostly black voters, 99% black voters, was they're not going to take our right to vote away. We know they're trying to do it, but they're not going to do that to us. And so people would wait for the 7 hours. Now people say, well, Judy, how come you didn't vote by absentee ballot? That's really crazy, that a voting rights lawyer wouldn't vote by absentee ballot. I forgot to get it, but it really is important that we understand that this is a moment where people saw the extent to which politicians would go to take their right to vote away. And so we believe this is an opportunity and this is a moment in which we, in this post-Shelby world, can really start to use the energy, the anger, the frustration, the idealism, the optimism about what our democracy is to really push for a constitutional amendment for a right to vote. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. I am going to shift gears to the very local level. I serve on city council in a place called Takoma Park. Just to give you a little background on Takoma Park, it has about 16,000 residents. There's 7 of us on city council. I represent about 2,500 of those people. Put out 3 numbers for you, 50, 40, 30. 50% of our residents or more are minority. 50% of our residents live in apartment buildings. 40% of our residents are under 30 years of age, including the children, the very youngest, up to voters. And 30% of our residents were born overseas. Those are all really important for what I'm going to get to when I talk about what we're doing in terms of our election initiatives. Our community strongly supports the idea of a right to vote. We passed a resolution about 2 months ago that calls on our federal representatives to support this effort by the congressman. We have called on our state legislators to do more to establish a right to vote in the state level. And then we took a number of initiatives directed at the city. I want to describe 4 things that I think are really important at a local level. The first is that we have to have issues that matter, right? We have to get voters to turn out because they see some value in turning out. That's a challenge. In order to do that, you don't just have to have the issues, but you also need information. And I tell you, when I campaigned, I met people who didn't know the city had a government. And these are people who vote in federal elections or state elections. They didn't know the city had a city council. They didn't know about that. So just at the very basic level, we need to have issues, and we need to have issues that we're able to communicate back to voters in a way that matters to them. At a local level, we need to have candidates, and most of the races in the city of Takoma Park and many places around the country, including at the national level, are unopposed. There isn't, it would be great if there were 2 candidates. There often is only 1, let alone 3 or 4 or 5. And then the final issue, the one I'm going to focus on, the one our recent efforts have focused on, is this idea of lowering barriers to participation and increasing incentives to participation. That's where, for us, in the city, we've focused on this idea of a right to vote and some specific local actions. So a little bit more background on the city. I mentioned some of those statistics about the community. 50% of our residents, as I said, live in apartment buildings. In 2012, 20% of those people turned out to vote. Well, that's horrible turnout, right? But in the election just the year before, the municipal election, the city election where I was elected, only 8% turned out. That's just sort of vanishingly small percent. 50% of our population, 8% turnout. The city already has a right for non-citizens to vote. So even if they're not U.S. citizens in our city, they can vote. We still had 8% turnout. On the side of the younger voters, about 15% of our voters are under 30. In 2012, we had great turnout. We had 60% turnout in the presidential election, just a little while ago. But the year before that, again, in that municipal election, 3% turnout of people under 30. I mean, I'm still shocked by that. I'm still trying to figure out if the numbers are wrong. I just can't imagine that few people turned out. And in 2010, they had turned out in about 20-25% in the midterm election. So, they showed up at some level, they disappeared, they showed up in pretty good numbers. So those are some of the statistics we were looking at. About 2 months ago, we finally passed, and it was a challenging debate. Right to vote resolution, we did the things I already described. We created a task force, a right to vote task force. It's meant to look at our laws and policies, look at how our elections work, and make additional recommendations. And we made a number of other changes. We established early voting in all elections. Early voting is mandated in all elections. We took away the barrier of voter registration so people can show up on election day and they can vote that same day. Those are changes that are in place in many other places. We became the first place in the country to lower the voting age to 16. So 16 and 17-year-olds, which is about 2% of our citywide population, can now vote in city elections. And we restored voting rights to some people with felony convictions, those people who are on parole, and I very much expect we're going to charge this task force we have with looking at full restoration of voting rights for people with felony convictions. And then the last change that we've made, which we just voted on at 10 o'clock last night, was to mandate that any candidate in any race, in a local race, in a state race, in the presidential race, if they're certified by the city as a candidate, as a valid candidate, can get access to those apartment buildings. And that, to me, and it's a state policy, state law in Minnesota, has been for many years. But I think we're the only place in Maryland that's picked this up. But the idea is that me as a candidate, and I don't have staff, it's just me knocking on doors, I have the ability to get in those apartment buildings, to talk to the residents in those places, and then to figure out how to serve their interests. Those are some of the initiatives that we're trying to take on the side of the lowering the barriers to participation. So I think these issues are really important. It's hard to champion them at a local level. Again, we don't have staff. It's supposed to be about potholes and sidewalks and police and lower taxes. There's the challenge of just explaining to people that we do have a government. That all takes a lot of time in a really part-time job. But there are really clear things you can do. And while we heard from people that that they thought this was going to dilute their right to vote, to have more people participate, or that they would only want these changes to go through if there was a referendum or far more time to study the issues, I think we found that we could generate local, popular pressure for people to come out and say these are really good things to do. Takoma Park is a very liberal place, but you take advantage of those opportunities when you have them, and that's what I think we did, and what I hope other communities would do. Just to close, as I said, there are other challenges. We need candidates, we need issues, we need just really basic information about what government does that matters to people. But in the context of this idea of a national right to vote, we as a community are really proud to support that and to do what we can at a local level to try to make some of these changes, to try to put some of these changes in place, to try to be a place that is experimenting on how to do a better job of getting turnout and bringing everybody into democracy. Thank you.
How's everyone doing? I'm always a little worried about podiums. Sometimes my assistant has to send, is there going to be a box for him to stand on or something? But we're good. My name is Rashad Robinson. I run an organization called colorofchange.org. It's the largest online civil rights organization in the country, and what we do is we transform moments into movements. Every single day, we're hit with all sorts of information. From the moment we wake up, we see the television, we read the newspaper, we see billboards, and that information oftentimes activates us. It makes us do something. We feel upset, angry, happy, but oftentimes after we see that information, we go back to doing what we were doing before. Sometimes in the age of social media, we will tweet out the information, like what I was doing over there a little while ago as I was listening to the other speakers and tweeting out things they were saying, or we go on Facebook, but we're oftentimes not engaged in anything meaningful after that. What we do at Color of Change, or what we do when we're at our best, is we take those moments and we connect people with other folks who are having that same reaction and give them something to do, creating an organizing moment and building power, hopefully long-term for our community. So for instance, when Glenn Beck went on the air and called President Obama racist with a deep-seated hatred for white people, that was a moment. People were angry, and Color of Change took that, captured folks, and led a 2-year campaign to get Glenn Beck fired from Fox by getting over 200 advertisers to leave Fox. And so the no longer people were still watching the Glenn Beck show, but they couldn't sell advertising for the show. Or the ALEC work that we did over this past year in response to voter ID and Trayvon Martin. And so, for us at Color of Change, it's always about civic engagement, and we see sort of an exercise analogy, we see sort of civic engagement as sort of we see voting as sort of the stretching of civic engagement. It's not gonna, help you lose that last 5 pounds, but if you don't do it, it's gonna hurt. And for us at Color of Change, we've consistently tried to work in our 8-year history of engaging folks around electoral reforms or fighting voter suppression. And we were watching as this Shelby case was decided, and we watched as Justice Scalia, kind of echoed this right-wing rhetoric of racial justice now being racial entitlement. And we were watching as this were happening, and we reached out to our friends at the Advancement Project and our friends at FairVote and other folks in the community to sort of think about that we knew this moment was gonna come down around Shelby, or we thought there was. And so what could we do to transform a movement? My own history with voting is one that really brings me into this work. My first real moment around activism, I remember, was in 1986 when I went into the voting booth with my grandfather, and he put me on his shoulders and let me pull the lever. And I didn't know till after he died that he couldn't read or write. My grandfather was born to sharecroppers in Virginia, and even in a country that didn't value his education, he believed that his participation mattered. He believed that he should, through his neighborhood civic association and by voting, he could make his voices heard. And for so many of our members, whether it is voter suppression or some other attempt to disenfranchisement, people still think their participation matters. And so we saw those long lines that Judy referenced during the election process. We see young people willing to take videotapes of police officers who are stop and frisking them or violating their rights in New York City and Oakland and other cities around the country. We see people still willing to stand up and fight back and push back. And so we knew if we gave folks something to do, they might do it. And so the question for us was, there are a lot of things that could be done in response to what Shelby was going to come down and say, or what we thought was going to be said. And there's a lot of great work that's going to be done and being done at the congressional level and at the state level. And we thought, what should our response be? And there's these groups of organizations that are talking about a constitutional amendment to the right to vote. There's folks that are going to be instantly going to congressional fixes. There's groups that are going to be sort of working at a state level. We didn't know if it was going to be a Section 4 conversation after, or a Section 5 conversation, or both. We felt like, in so many ways, we watched as an organization as the various cases were being debated at the Supreme Court this session. You saw the DOMA and the Prop 8 cases, and in my previous job, I spent a lot of my time training many of those couples that were on TV, training them to tell their personal stories. And then we saw folks gathered out in front of the courtrooms, telling their stories, proud, aspirational. We've watched over the past several months and years these brave young people, the dreamers, marching and telling their stories and talking about aspirational things. And then we were in front of the courtroom at Shelby waiting for buses that never showed up. And in so many ways, it was about protecting what we've earned and won, what folks in my grandfather's generation earned and won so that he could put his grandson on his shoulders and bring him into the voting booth. But there was no sort of aspirational moment of what we want now, of what we're asking people to do. And so we felt like the moment of Shelby had, our response had to, if it were to be a movement, had to ask people to do something, to be for something, not just against something. And so we joined the movement that Rob and Judy and other folks are. We've launched freetovote.org and engaged a number of our partners in the online organizing space, from Credo to Move On to Democracy for America. After the response hit, we kind of went out to our members. We have nearly 300,000 folks that have already signed up to freetovote.org and signed up to the movement. We see this not just as a conversation that will be working locally, and I know that I don't want to steal Patricia's thunder. I know she's going to talk a lot about what's going to be happening at the local level around the country in terms of getting people to do resolutions and the work that was already talked about in Takoma Park, but that's work that we'll be engaging our members in. Also sort of the longer term work of utilizing this energy, this 300,000 that I believe will be 400,000 soon and more, leveraging that energy in the state level work that will be opening up voting around early voting, ending felony disenfranchisement, all these pieces to keep the energy going. All with this idea that we can leverage technology, good messaging, and storytelling to get people engaged in long-term efforts to make real changes in their community, elevating the voices of everyday people. And at the end of the day, right, that's, I think, the best thing we can do. But I'm here, and our organization is here, because on all these issues around civil rights, we're really looking at new ways of thinking about doing it, being inspired by the loving and committed couples that have been telling their stories and getting people engaged, or the dreamers who have been marching and asking people to stand for them, and thinking about how do we do this work in a way, how do we tell cultural stories that gets people behind being for something, wanting to stand up for something and not just being against something. And so that's what the work we're doing here. It's freetovote.org. One of the best ways, folks, people always say, how can we support or get engaged? The best ways is to go online and sign up and share with your friend, family, neighbor, network, to tweet it out, to send it to your email list, to get people engaged and informed. And our goal will be and our commitment over the next several months and years is to give people meaningful ways to engage in their communities, both locally and nationally, asking people to engage, giving them clear theories of change about how their engagement will make a difference, and hopefully having a lot of successful wins along the way. So thank you all very much.
Well, I guess I want to first tell you all about why I initially became interested in a right to vote. And then I want to tell you all about an incredible project that FairVote is working on that focuses on community voting rights. I originally became interested in a right to vote in college. I went to college in Kentucky, and in Kentucky, when you are convicted of a felony, you lose your right to vote permanently. It's gone. I participated in a service project where we did a hygiene product and household product drive. So we got all of this stuff together, and then we brought it to this program that helped women who had committed felonies, which basically helped them re-enter into a community. So we give them all of this stuff, and they're like, well, would you like to meet some of the people that you're helping? We're like, of course we'd like to meet them. So the next day, we come back, and there's a room full of the women that we were, giving these products to, and we have lunch with them. We're sitting there, we're eating pizza, we're chatting, talking about nothing mostly, and then we were talking about some of their problems, and that became something. They started talking about how hard it was to get a job with something on your record. They started talking about how difficult it was to find an apartment with something on your record. But something that really struck me was one woman, she looked at us and she said, I can't even vote. And that struck me because I thought, wow, that's just a very petty way to devalue somebody. So years later, I started working at FairVote, and we started working on a project. It's called Promote Our Vote, and you can find it at promoteourvote.com. And what this project does is it basically gets communities involved. Communities involved in promoting our right to vote. And so what we do is we work with community leaders, individuals, organizations, universities, and what we do is we try to get them to pass what we call right to vote resolutions. Now these resolutions, they have 4 goals. They work to increase participation, they work to protect access, they generate conversation about expanding suffrage, and they also build a movement for a constitutional right to vote, which would shift the burden for being able to vote from the individual to the government, which is so important. So we've worked with Tim Male, and generally we provide support such as communications assistance or electoral research or legal assistance. But what we found so interesting about this is once we started working with Tim Male, he started coming to us with ideas. And we're like, oh, I thought we were supposed to be giving you some ideas. He's like, well, what about 16-year-old voting? We're like, oh, well, that's new. How do we feel about that? We did the research on it. It's a great idea. It actually helps people form a lifelong habit of voting. We ended up supporting that. And we ended up sharing that idea with a lot of other people. And that's something that's central to our project. Democracy is not one size fits all. We should have uniform laws, of course, to make sure that everyone can get to the polls and make sure that everyone can vote. But there are some innovative policies out there that we've seen spring up. Now, what do these right to vote resolutions do? They set up task forces, which I'm actually on Takoma Park's task force, or I will be, hopefully, if I'm approved. And these
you were
task
approved
forces,
last night.
And what these task forces do is they look at laws and they look at procedures and they say, is our city doing everything as well as it could do it? If the answer is no, then they make recommendations and they try to change policies. They try to see how they can improve democracy. Another important thing that these resolutions do is they call on elected officials for other voting rights issues. So, for example, the VRA law that was struck down. We have language in our draft resolutions to basically call on Congress people to come up with a new formula. And the central thing that these resolutions do is they call on Congress, they call on the president, they call on governors to pass a right to vote or to support a right to vote amendment. So we are kind of taking a on-the-ground, to-the-hill approach. We're generating a movement for a right to vote in the Constitution. And you can become a part of that on our website, which is promoteourvote.com. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Patricia. I will need to be coming to that Takoma Park Farmers Market more often to see all the miracles that happen there. Lastly, I want to introduce a panelist who I didn't introduce before because he was delayed by weather, which is John Nichols. John similarly embodies that local/Washington connection on these issues. He is the Washington editor of The Nation and a columnist for The Nation, but also writes from and writes a lot about Madison, Wisconsin, where I believe he's Congressman Pocan's neighbor. And he's the author, most recently, of a book with Bob McChesney called Dollarocracy, which is a fascinating kind of long-term look at the shift, at how politics shifted in favor of money and capital over the last 30 years or so. And without further ado, I'll just introduce John, and then we'll do some questions and answers.
Thank you. Well, I am tremendously honored to be here, and I promise you, I've tried harder to be here than anyone else in the room. I started in Madison, Wisconsin this morning, and I was on a flight to Cincinnati, and then I was on a flight to Detroit, and then I was on a flight to Minneapolis, and finally the flight to Minneapolis made it to Washington, DC. And I would suggest to you that for the average American, that's about as hard as it is to get through to Washington. I am tremendously honored to be here with these folks. Mark Pocan was literally sending me texts, so I know exactly what he said in complete detail. And I've covered most of these people in different aspects of their careers and in their struggles, especially my dear friend Rashad, who we not too long ago tried to figure out how to get things started. Rob Ritchie, who, if he hasn't gotten 10 rounds of applause today, deserves one more because FairVote is such a central grouping. And we make a big deal about the fact that it is the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Justice. We make a big deal about the fact that that march was influenced by the killing of Medgar Evers 50 years ago as well. What we do not always remember is that 66 years ago, according to many of the great historians of the civil rights movement, the movement began not in Washington, D.C., but in Decatur, Mississippi. And in Decatur, Mississippi, Medgar Evers and Charles Evers and their fellow veterans of World War II put on parts of their uniforms, put on their medals, and they walked down the main street of their hometown to register and vote. They were met by a mob of armed white citizens who had gathered to deny them that right to vote. It was actually 66 years ago last week. And they went down there once and they were met by that mob. They went home, they organized more people, and they went down again and were met by that mob. And they kept going, and Medgar Evers said it was on that day that he realized that he would devote the rest of his life, every living moment he had, to the struggle for the right to vote. Because the struggle for the right to vote was central to the struggle for all other rights. And Evers had read W.B. Du Bois. Du Bois had written to the veterans, for initially of World War I and then World War II, "You have fought overseas for democracy, now come home fighting. Come home fighting for democracy here." And he had taken that seriously, more seriously than a previous generation that had struggled for civil rights but not been fully willing to confront at that level, literally the level of life and death. Now, the important thing to understand about this right to vote struggle is that it is rooted in those stories, in those moments. This is not about the Voting Rights Act. Although I honor that act and will fight as hard as I can to renew it in every way possible. This is not about voting structures in particular states or about early voting or voter ID or voter registration. All these fights that we have so many struggles. There are so many people who still struggle to deny or undermine or infringe on that right to vote. But this is about the core right, about the right itself, about this core concept, that it is from the vote that all freedom extends. That Medgar Evers was right. He was right to risk his life in that cause, in what he referred to, what Du Bois referred to as that holy cause. Now, when Bob McChesney and I were writing this book on democracy, we looked at all the struggles of our current moment, and it is so easy to be overwhelmed by them. We have economic and social struggles that are unmet, undealt with. We have a Congress that is literally, definitionally dysfunctional. We have state governments that actually remind us of why we like dysfunction better than a functional government. And so we live at a point where there is so much that needs to be done. And someone will come to you and they will say, you know, the environment, we have climate change, that's got to be number one. We have somebody else who will come to you and they will say, labor rights, worker rights, that's got to be number one. People have to have a decent job. We will have friends who will come to us and they will say, look, at the end of the day, we've got to dial down our militarism. We've got to change how we operate in the world. All of these people are right. And yet, at some fundamental level, none of their goals are viable unless we focus on the right to vote. And so as we kept going back into this struggle and looking for where do we begin, do we say, well, yes, Citizens United should be overturned. We should get money out of politics. Absolutely, no question of that. Yes, we've got to do away with gerrymandering. Absolutely, no question of that. Yes, we need to get rid of the Electoral College that put in the White House of the United States a man who the majority, or at least the plurality of people in this country voted against in 2000. These are basic goals, they are all correct. And yet, as they jockey for position, we lose sight of that core concept. That all of those concerns, gerrymandering, the Electoral College, money in politics, they all come down to this question of the vote. If we diminish the vote with money in politics, making the dollar more important than the vote, if we diminish the vote with gerrymandering, creating districts where the vote does not matter or it has limited meaning, if we diminish the vote by creating an Electoral College that says that even though people may vote for someone to be president, someone else becomes the president, if we do all these things, at the end of the day, we create a circumstance that does not function for all the other goals that we have. And so the conclusion that we came to was that a right to vote amendment is the absolutely essential step. It becomes the place of beginning for all the other reforms, and historically there is so much evidence to confirm this. The fact of the matter is, long before Medgar Evers and long before all of the struggles of the civil rights movement, we had ages of reform in this country. We have had 3 great ages of reform in the United States: the 1860s and their aftermath, the Progressive Era, and then the 1960s. Each of these, not just about the economic reforms that you may have seen in the New Deal, but structural reforms that extended democracy. And all 3 of them had at their core the right to vote. The 1860s saw constitutional amendments that extended the right to vote to African Americans, former slaves. The Progressive Era saw a struggle for the right to vote for women, and also for a struggle to make sure that senators were elected and not appointed. And it is important to remember that the 1960s, the first great victory of the 1960s, in 1962, was a constitutional amendment to eliminate the poll tax. Every one of these great eras of reform had at its heart a right to vote. And I'll just close with one notion from the Progressive Era. Because people tell me, they say, oh, these are wonderful folks up here. Look at these smart people, right? And we even got a congressman to come down amid votes. That's fabulous. But a right to vote, amending the Constitution is ridiculous. It can't be done. It's impossible to amend the Constitution. Why, it's never happened before. 27, 28 times. But the founders didn't want the Constitution amended. Well, no, they did 10 amendments right off the bat. Everybody will tell you how hard a constitutional amendment is, how overwhelming it is. I will tell you this. It is not that hard today compared to what it was in 1910. In 1910, if you looked across this republic, you would see a country where children were chained to machines, where little girls had their fingers cut off as they put the bobbins on machines in factories, where women would, when a fire began in their factory, leap from the 10th or 11th floor to their death because the doors had been locked shut. We had an economic and social injustice in this country that seems comparable to the countries across the world that we now point to with derision. And underpinning that was the fact that women did not have the right to vote, that our Senate was not elected, and that if it was elected, we did not have the power to tax corporations or the wealthy. 10 years later, in this country, women had the right to vote, the Senate was elected, and we had established a tax system that had within it the possibility of progressive and fair taxation. Fundamental shifts in the direction and scope of the American Republic, but beginning with that right to vote focus. Brothers and sisters, I don't care what you care about. I don't care what your first issue is. I will tell you this. Begin with the right to vote and believe that within 1 decade, by 2020, we will have finished a new age of reform with its center, the right to vote, but with so many other necessary and essential reforms. Believe that, and you will make it so, and you will realize the genius of Medgar Evers and of W.E.B. Du Bois when he said, "We fight overseas for democracy. Now let's come home fighting for democracy in America." Thank you very much.